our overt focus is going to be on different technologies for the most part. And then there are some themes that I think will get brought out as we begin. I want to thank our panel, Peggy Barker, Greg Lusher, and Dave Hirschberger for agreeing to talk today. And Dave has agreed that he and Greg are going to get into a pushing fight during the panel discussion to keep things perked up after lunch. Let's see if I can just do this. Of course, we want to give credit to where credit is due and thank NIDR for supporting all of our work. When we started out, Sue and I started out talking about what we're going to do. We identified about 6 areas and started flushing those out, and then had a conversation with Janice and Melanie, and they said, well, we've got 3 and we don't know how we're going to get done. So we kind of looked, so we're not going to get done, and I guarantee that we will ultimately miss a lot, disappoint, and it will be very biased in what we have to say. We're really out to, in part to inform, but also to provoke the discussion for today. And I think we have, it's a challenging thing to be up here talking to this wide, diverse group, and because of the diversity, everybody knows more collectively than we do, and at the same time, everybody has very particular interests and areas of knowledge. So here are the areas that we are going to try to address over the course of our half hour. I would like to start out, though, I was at the Museum of Modern Art a few weeks ago with my wife, and we were looking around. Actually, Graham, who's the person that did the light spoons?
Charles and Ray Eames.
Yeah, the Eames. So there's a really nice design exhibition in which the Eames are shown, not only both for the art, for the splint, as well as all the furniture and things like that came out. Terrific show. But we were there, and I saw this artist that I had recognized before. The artist's name is Tempt1, or Tempt, and Tempt is sort of his tag. And Tempt is one of the major graffiti artists, along with Banksy and people worldwide that have been elevating that form of cultural art into a much higher art form and doing really risky kinds of things. And here's an example of his art. He's shown all over the world. 2003, Tempt acquired ALS. And you can see what a physical art form that is, and in graffiti art, a lot of it has to do with how fast you're doing it, how physically involved, where you're doing it, because the more precarious places you do it, the better, right? This is some of his latest work. And so basically he got together with an engineer, or an engineer contacted him and wanted to help him do that. And so this is really, I think, embraces what Sue and I have tried to think about, and that is some of the underlying things, the obvious ones: science, technology, clinical practice. But perhaps more important are issues of performance and identity, because that really embraces, I think, what we all do as communicators. Sometimes it's hard for us social and behavioral scientists to really realize some of those issues, particularly the identity issue, and I'll have to say that Graham has taught me a lot about that. But I think that Tempt really embraces all of those issues in incredible ways. So here's Tempt. This is the first device that he had. He later, I think, has a Tobii screen that he interacts with, but this was a $50 PlayStation concoction that his engineer worked with. And you can see this is a reproduction of Tempt's eye movements, and here he is doing some of his work. And I have a quick video to show you.
9. Moving at 9 is part of the place right there. And right there in this room, or right there out there in public. Just last night we were out in downtown Los Angeles, dark corners of downtown Los Angeles. And I stood there in some dark corner, fearing for my life. No, up there at the tall building, unbelievable. Someone was tagging Tim's name up there. That was actually Tony Throwing in a hospital room, and miles away, it was being projected onto the wall of the building. It was happened to be ironically next to a freeway, so people that were driving by were able to enjoy it as well.
So until now, Tempt, at least up until now, Tempt is still a productive artist, and in fact, you can think of this marriage of technology and innovation and identity and performance that Tempt now has expanded as a consequence of this in arenas that he's never been able to do before. So that's one of the bookends of this. Sue's going to talk about multimodal input and general computing and social networks, and then I'll get back on and talk.
Can you guys hear me in the back? I sat in the back all day and it's kind of hard to hear, so just do this if I get low. So I'm going to start with multimodal, multi-input access. I really don't have a good term for this, but what I'm really referring to is just the physical access to the technology. And traditionally we've focused on, not always, but traditionally on a kind of a single access method, and it's usually the best, most reliable physical access movement system that we look at when we're doing clinical evaluations and access to AAC technology. But if you look at the way individuals communicate and the AAC systems that they use, they're typically not just a single access sort of system. They usually, the person themselves in a low and a high-tech way, incorporate a variety of modalities and movements and signals when they're communicating. And so I want us to think a bit about how we can get technology to start to implement these different sorts of movements and signals for potentially more effective communication. I'm just going to touch briefly on just some of the challenges and the benefits to both sorts of methods. Obviously, the benefit of using a single access strategy is you've targeted the most reliable and consistent movement, but what might be challenging is that while at the point of evaluation that was the most reliable and consistent movement, it may not be the most reliable and consistent throughout the day. So it may limit the amount of time the person can actually access the system or the device that they're using, or the computer. And also it sets the person up potentially for fatigue, depending on what the medical condition is. And also something that we don't really know a lot about, but we kind of see clinically, is the potential for overuse sorts of injuries. When people used head sticks, when that was implemented quite frequently, we ended up seeing about 10 or 15 years later a lot of head and neck pain associated with head stick use. And recently, clinically, I've noticed a lot of individuals who used head switches, as they grow older, they're starting to have similar issues and pain associated with that. So we're starting to look at alternative access, such as eye gaze, for those individuals. So if you look at a multi-input strategy, what are some of the potential benefits? Maybe a more efficient method to your accessing your computer system, allowing for access throughout the day. Another idea might be a way to promote additional movements and train additional movements. So for an individual who has like an acquired injury, maybe a brainstem stroke or severe impairment where they're pretty locked in, but they're starting to have some emerging movements, physical movements, instead of zeroing in on the most consistent, reliable movement, which may be eye gaze, perhaps they have a little bit of hand movement and can start incorporating that, then maybe over time that becomes more efficient and more effective for them. So it's might have a therapeutic benefit. And some of the challenges associated with that, again, is just our technological limitations, that there are no computers or SGDs that really incorporate multiple modalities, multiple methods. And also, it's a really difficult task because there are a lot of individual differences. one person might have a certain set of movement capabilities and another person may have a completely different set. How do you anticipate that and how do you design technology that can support that? I'll just give you an example here, and this is really more of a multi-input strategy of a little bit of research that I've been involved with. And it focused on using speech recognition as part of this multi-input strategy. There's been a considerable amount of engineering efforts behind dysarthric speech recognition over the years. It's primarily been successful for people who are mildly dysarthric or for very small limited vocabulary sets, such as environmental control applications, so maybe a set of 10 commands. But for people who are more severe, moderate and severely and profoundly dysarthric, speech recognition typically isn't a functional writing tool and not a functional communication tool. So this project, the Supplemented Speech Recognition Project, that collaborators Tom Jacobs with Indotech, Dave Buchelman, and John Paul Hossam, looked at a system that used speech recognition based on dysarthric speech, but also incorporating first letter identification or alphabet supplementation. So as the person was intended to write a word, they would type the first letter of the word, that was the target word, and then it also incorporated language modeling and word prediction. So multiple inputs into the computer, in addition to the dysarthric speech signal, help the computer understand more effectively what the individual was saying. We had individuals who were severe to profoundly dysarthric having keystroke savings up to 75 and 80% using this sort of technology. And I wanted to also recognize others, Dang and Patel and colleagues have also been looking at this whole dysarthric speech recognition area, and they coupled that with surface EMG signals, so not just that signal itself, but surface EMG to help increase the accuracy of recognition. So just a little bit of few examples of using multiple inputs for computer applications. In general computer navigation, mouse control, and writing, this is a bit of a quandary because insurance in the United States pays for SGDs based on really medical and face-to-face communication techniques and doesn't quite recognize writing, emailing, texting, those sorts of forms of communication as medically necessary. So obviously we focused our development efforts and our software development efforts on software that supports face-to-face communication. However, those clinicians in the audience and people who know and have worked with individuals with disabilities know that they really have a strong desire for more mainstream computer access options. There's quite an emphasis on that, and in fact, the majority of the patients with ALS that I work with at our facility use email, Facebook as their primary mode of communication, and when we evaluate, that's their determining factor. That's how they make their decisions on the kind of device that they want to use. We did a follow-up study, I think Dave Buchelman mentioned it earlier, on early eye gaze use, early eye gaze system use. That's when Erica was the first fundable eye gaze system on the market, when we followed 15 individuals with ALS and documented their use of the system. And well over 70% of them used it for web-type applications, emailing, those types of things. So even then they were used pretty significantly for that. But with current SGDs, there's a lot of limitations of the computers that house that kind of software. They're not very powerful. And they often have to use some sort of interface that a person has to use in order to do traditional web applications. And just to show you an example, this is the grid software. It's housed on an IntelliGaze eye gaze system. And this is the interface you would use if you want to do web browsing. It's different than you or I, how we use the computer when we do web browsing. And there's a very good reason they set these up. It's because eye gaze systems have very poor resolution. It's very difficult to hit small links and targets on a computer. So you really can't access a computer desktop with an eye gaze system in a traditional way that we're all probably used to doing. So you have to have these larger targets. But it requires you to learn something new. It's visually a bit distracting. Here's an example of email, same sort of application. You just have to learn a whole new system. And there's also limitations within the software itself, in that you can't click on links in your email, and it just can be really cumbersome, especially if you're really proficient at using just traditional mainstream methods of doing email and web access. So some of the benefits to being able to access your computer in a standard way is some of the, as Melanie had mentioned earlier, the working memory and the sort of the cognitive aspects of that, we really would like to be able to tap into things that are overlearned, things that we're familiar with, especially if you have an acquired injury. You might have some mild cognitive deficits associated with that, or you might have a declining condition where your cognition will be declining over time. If you can tap into things that you've already learned and you're very used to using, the chances are you're going to be more successful and you're going to be able to use it for a longer period of time. And this is also basically, how we now communicate through a computer. We use these sort of standard interfaces, so it would make sense that we strive to make sure we have access to these sort of standard interfaces. And then social networking is just my last point, and it kind of falls along with the general computing piece, but it really warrants a little special attention on the side, because this is really a common form of communication. And it's daily, it's hourly, it's minute by minute, second by second for some people. And social networking is kind of this big, broad, and umbrella term, and I'm using it very broadly, and I'm referring to social networking sites like Facebook, MySpace, there's a Google Plus now, texting, chat, instant messaging, all of those types of social networking applications. And this is very appealing for those who have limited access to the face-to-face communication, which might be, it's a pretty large population of individuals who rely on AAC. A lot of them they might be in skilled nursing facilities, they might be hospitalized for a period of time. Many are not employed, they may be at home, they have limited opportunities to get out in the community. It's how they interface with their friends, interface with the community, and it's a way to express their own personal identity. Socially interact without the time constraints that are imposed with a face-to-face interaction that Jeff will probably talk a bit about later. So some of the challenges with interfacing with the social network sites, and I think in our focus groups we kind of mentioned that earlier today, that the software doesn't very seamlessly work with some of these sites. Usually you have to use the interface and get on the web and that way and access them that way, but they're not specifically designed to nicely interact with those sites. And then also the whole concept, and not to just beat up the manufacturers and the technology developers, this is a really difficult task because it's a constantly moving target. And so how do we adapt software and continue to make it accessible and work well to something that's changing monthly and almost weekly and daily in some cases. Also, how do people actually use social networking with their systems? There's a whole area of research there that we don't truly understand. A lot of the things I'm telling you today are based on my own personal experiences and my own assumptions, but I can't speak for everybody in this room, and I certainly can't speak for the whole population of individuals who rely on AAC, and we really don't understand how they're currently doing it, and also what are some potential opportunities for them in the future. Easy use, I just kind of mentioned that earlier, and then how do you seamlessly integrate these sort of what I consider more mainstream functions into AAC technology. It's definitely a challenge for us.
I'm going to pop back just a second to social networking and make this transition. We've been working on a project in the RERC where we are interviewing individuals with ALS and their families, and we were recently out in Detroit working with Lisa Bardak on this project, and brought home some videos, and we're looking at a video of a young man, 26 years old, with motor neuron disease, and he's in an interview situation, and he's telling us that as you would expect, that his social network has really shrunk, and that he has a few friends that come visit him and he's really lost a lot of friends. Well, we also have 2 video cameras, and one is on the screen. And so what is this guy doing? While he's interviewing, and he and his mom are talking to us, well, he's downloaded 3 movies during that time as he's talking to us, and he's also on Facebook. And so as we're looking at this, I asked, well, how many friends does he have on Facebook? And he has a type of Facebook account you can go on and look at. It's 530 friends. So we're really looking at a game-changing technology, particularly for people within whose culture and age aggregate the kinds of displays of identity and those kinds of things. We're not afraid of hiding that. In fact, then transact their friendships through Facebook, not like many of us. And when it was, you go back and we all looked at each other, how many friends do we have on Facebook? Those of us that use it. It's pretty humble. So I'm going to switch to mobile computing, primarily sort of the iPad era. The first picture up there was done in 1980. It was the first video I made. Gene Mears and Cinda Bottorff. Some of you know Cinda, some of you might know Gene. And here he is that long ago interacting. The primary mode of interaction with the device is a language board. This is from a project just over the last couple of years of a young man working with one of my research assistants with a dedicated device. And this was taken last summer of another young man in our clinic who's getting ready to go to camp, and he didn't want to take his dedicated device, so he's on a iPad, and now he can go to camp. He can get in and out of his wheelchair really easily. He can play games with all his buddies at camp. He can do all these kinds of things. Just here's the state of the tablets as of yesterday, day before yesterday. A Google tablet came out a while ago. Microsoft Surface came out. I have a hard time remembering that name for some reason. Kindle Fire, and of course the ubiquitous iPad. There's a plethora of these technologies. We know they'll never go away. It's always going to get more. And with Google entering the scene, the Android market, I think, is in a game-changing situation. So the state of mobile computing, you guys gave this talk during your conversations today and in the meetings that we had at our table, so I'm going to be pretty brief. Just to reflect what everybody said, it's an incredibly disruptive technology, and I don't think that we've witnessed anything like it before. And one of the key characteristics is just the incredibly rapid change, which is isolating or sort of disempowering the research, because anytime that we grab something to look at, the technology has shifted and shifted dramatically. And I think that that's a big challenge for us as people who define ourselves as researchers. I think it marks the rise of the individual, and that is it allows individuals to purchase the over-the-counter devices and not necessarily rely on prescriptions. And it is challenging to the existing institutions like clinicians and the stable industry. And it's causing all kinds of problems that we have been talking about for the last couple of years. Two quick stories. I have an ex-student that is a director of a clinic in Halifax. Last year she wrote me that they're doing a study. They had two iPads and two iPhones, and they were working on figuring out how they were going to integrate them into their clinical practice. 9 months later, they wrote me they had 44 devices. That's one story. The other story is I was at the New York Speech and Hearing Association giving a talk on iPads, and there was an issue where somebody wanted to know something about protocol and how you could do something with it. I didn't have the answer, and my colleague didn't have the answer. And I guess it was crowdsourced because the whole group of 80, 90 people that were there not only provided the answer, but took the talk away from us, and it became a massive help session. And when I asked a friend of mine, what happened? He said, well, it's because it doesn't rely on specialists anymore. That is, everybody has an iPad, the interfaces are similar enough, and certainly there's some specific knowledge, but it has shifted. So we're looking at a very, obviously, a very big challenge to us professionally and to consumers. What I do want to show you is a little piece of video because it's one of the persisting problems, and I wanted us to share an issue about access and to look at it, and to look at a problem. I'm not saying that when you look at this individual that the iPad is the right device for them, but you certainly can see what some of the problems are in terms of simple physical access, which alienates many of the people that we work with. You can see all, so he's flipping it unintentionally, he's flipping it back. He's selecting something he didn't need to select. So my challenge to developers here, and to really to all of us, is why haven't we solved these issues? And why isn't this at the, no. Why isn't this at the top of our list? So we really need to be working on improving physical access, making use of gestures and this incredible sophisticated gesture interface on these devices, and figuring out ways that we can leverage that for people who need physical accommodations. There are major interoperability issues. People need to have equal access across applications, which we certainly can't have on the iPad. Coordinate across technologies. Single source input, such as here's Google Glass. It's up here that came off the web the other day with a new announcement about Google Glass being available in 2.13. And here's the original Google Glasses, and I have heard that Jordy may sue Google for patent infringement. I'm going to shift, since I only have now 3 minutes for 2 more topics. Natural language processing and AAC are 2 examples that are we're all familiar with. Down below is an Enkidu, close to my heart, word prediction system, which is a natural language processing approach. And up here is Cliff Tushler's swipe system, all using natural language processing techniques in terms of trying to predict. There are a number of emerging areas in natural language processing, using the internet projects that we worked on for topic specification, utterance-based communication, geo-positioning down below. You can see My Voice's solution to that, one of the only commercial apps out doing that. We've done work on partner talk and trying to leverage partner talk into prediction. These are all what I would call emerging areas. Text simplification, which has a lot of application, I'll show you in a minute, brain-computer interfaces. This is an example of text simplification. You get a piece of text, let's say from the internet, and through an NLP process, you can parse that text in a couple of different ways. You can make simple sentences out of it, and I would say that to challenge to developers that one of the things we should be doing is taking that and making it into utterance, making it so that we can issue these texts as utterances so that you can download what happened with the Yankees and be able to talk about it easily. The other is text summarization, similar, which is a really important type of technology, I think, for people with compromised reading skills, so that you could read the newspaper and be able to comprehend more originally complex texts. State of the NLP, keystroke savings, really, I mean, there's some nice research out there, but it has not moved very much in the last 10 or 15 years. And the technologies that I talked about as emerging really are, for the most part, in the lab right now. And there's, I think, some problems with making those transitions into the workplace. Speech recognition still doesn't support this art of speech or conversational discourse. This comes from one of our colleagues, Albert Robillard, who's a sociologist with a motor neuron disease.
One.
I gotta be kidding.
45 is like
And he says stock replies do not have built-in recipient design. That is, they're not made for the person that you're talking to. Pre-formulated turns at talk cannot adapt to the particular words used and to the specific settings of the verbal exchange. These pre-designed turns at talk feel like heavy weights encumbering natural conversation. I bring this up because utterance-based systems are very close to my heart, and I feel that I always need to be reading the detractors. But what Albert really brings up is the first point. Does the innovation matter? Okay? Does the 5% difference in word prediction matter? Does the text simplification innovation matter to the person? So in considering what we were talking about earlier about divided attention, operability, what are the operation requirements of these technologies? What's the payoff? We do not have robust access to the internet, and so how do we build these new technologies which rely on the internet so that they work without the internet? And how do we develop the underlying data structures and databases? It's the kind of thing that that we're mostly oblivious to, but some of the real advancements in this field, whether it's an utterance-based communication system or whether it's word prediction for the next generation, are going to rely on much more sophisticated approaches. And I'm not sure we have the industry to do that. And I'm wrapping up. And I would be glad to talk to you about social interaction, which is what I really wanted to talk about. I'll wrap up with two things. I really think that as we look at these devices, we really need to look at what people do with them. We have speech generation devices, and that's what they're labeled, and I would make a challenge now to go and interact and watch people interacting with these devices and see how much of that is visually mediated. Okay, there are some pictures up here about people looking at display screens. My colleague Priya and I have been working in looking at how people use visual displays, how to leverage it, and it's pretty interesting to see how much the displays of devices that are never intended to be used as co-constructing instruments are used. And second, I'm going to leave you with two quotes. This is from Dan Keplinger, who is an artist and was the focus of a movie, King Yum. It's about voice and identity, and I really wanted to say this to follow up on what Graham says. He says, if people told me I was going to make it in college, I'd have to master a computer voice. But I hated the damn thing. Nobody knows the real man, not even my mom. I'm worried that people will not talk to me, but to the computer. There is no way in hell a computer voice can express the emotion I have inside me. And the second one, doctoral student of mine, Jen Seal, who I think will be a really important person when she finally gets out. This came out of a paper that she just wrote in part of her PhD, and she says, in part of the introduction, advancements in the field can be credited in part for the reality that some augmented communicators are employed, college graduates, living independently, and engaged in various community activities. And I think we should feel really good about that. And then she finishes up by saying, but increased opportunities for augmented speakers to express themselves in a predominantly speaking culture are perhaps the most important result of AAC developments. So just keeping those kinds of goals in mind. And I'll turn this over to the panel for further discussion.